Hey, what's going on, everybody? I'm Sam. I am a student of the Bible. I've been a pastor for 22 years. If you want to read anything I write, you can go to my website, samburke.org. If you want to, you can check that out. My training involves biblical studies, theology, and biblical languages. We're going to jump into the book of James. We're in chapter 5, and we are going to be looking at verses 7 through 12 today. But before we get there, one of the things that I like to do whenever I'm looking through New Testament book especially is I like to try to not only look at the biblical text that's there, some of the practical stuff that you can glean from it, historical stuff, but I like to look at the theological side of it. Okay, so what do we learn theologically from these books? You know, what are some things that we can glean? If you go back to not this last Theology Thursday, but the week before, I talked about the some different kinds of like categories of theology. We talked about biblical theology, systematic theology, historical theology. We talked about practical theology. So what I'm talking about when you look at a New Testament book and you kind of see the theology in the book is that we're really talking about biblical theology. What does this book of the Bible, what is this letter, what is it, whatever, what's the theology that the author is trying to espouse? What are they trying to communicate theologically? And how do we see it maybe growing over time? Or is it something that's like a theological premise all through the New Testament, or those kind of things? And so it's different than systematic theology, because systematic theology is more like, okay, so what are these like buckets of theology? Kind of like what we did last Thursday with Theology Thursday, when I was like, we're going to talk about theology proper, and we're going to find verses that proof text theology proper all through the scriptures. That's different. That's systematic theology. Biblical theology is taking a book of the Bible and going, okay, what are the theological themes that this author is dwelling on? What are the theological themes that they're kind of camping on, and are these like growing? And if you go back to the beginning of the book of James studies that we've been doing, what I've been saying is that James, like I've been putting forth this argument that James, the book of James, what we're seeing here is actually theology that's in transition. That's kind of what I want to argue through this study, is that we're seeing an early version of Christianity, and the theology is in this transitory time. And so you see that there was a Jewishness about the faith. There's a Jewishness. Jesus comes on the Jewishness. There's a very Jewish version of the faith early on, is what I'm trying to say, and that before the gospel went to the Gentiles, it was mostly Jewish people. And they were practicing Jews who accepted Jesus as their Messiah. And their theology began to shift as the Gentiles began to receive the gospel. And then Paul ends up going to Europe and taking the gospel to Europe, and more Gentiles come to know Christ, and the theology kind of grows and expands. And so what we see in the book of James is what I've been trying to argue, is that we see this transitionary version of the faith before it kind of fully blooms into what it's going to become when Paul takes the gospel to the Gentiles. And then you have the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15, and then it kind of settles into a little more of kind of New Testament faith in Christ, with Gentiles involved and included and all that kind of stuff. And so what you see here with some of the theological themes that James brings up can feel very like very law-based. Sometimes you'll have some of these things that feel very much like Judaism, and that would be totally James. But you have Jesus as Messiah, right? So one of the things that I wanted to do real quickly here is I want to talk about some of the theological themes that we've discovered through our journey with James, and then I want to jump into the text, okay? Because this text actually highlights a theological theme that we've talked about before, and we'll continue to talk about today. But some of the theological themes that we've picked up in the book of James is that, first and foremost, God is a giver. that what do we learn about God through the book of James? Is we learn that God is someone who loves to give. Okay, he's a giver. We see that God is a giver of wisdom. If you ask God for wisdom, he's going to grant that. He wants to give that. We see that God is the giver of every good, perfect gift comes from God. And so he wants to give good gifts. So God is a giver. That's one of the theological themes that James wants to bring up, that those who love God, who are faithful to him, God is a giver to them. Another thing that we see all throughout the pages of the book of James is a theological theme of the fact that God values humble wisdom. God values humility. God values humble wisdom. It's something that pops up over and over and over again. Another theological theme that we see is that God values a faith that works, a faith that follows the works of the law as it relates to what he calls the royal law, or to love your neighbor as yourself. And James hits that one home over and over and over again. That the way we treat other people has a lot to say about the faith that we profess. And that's a theological theme that we see over and over again in the book of James. The theme that we're going to look at today is that God rewards patience. That God rewards patience. We see that in James chapter 1, where it says, where James says, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know the testing of your faith produces perseverance." Okay, so God rewards your patience in the testing of your faith with perseverance, with the ability to stand up underneath it. Well, today he's going to talk more about patience, because he's just talked about people who are using their wealth to oppress people who are poor. And he's trying to help these people who are feeling oppressed, who are feeling like they're being mistreated. He just says at the end of verse 6, he says, "You've condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you, and you were opposing them," basically is what he's saying to them. And he goes after people who are using their wealth in an oppressive way towards people who don't have anything and have no means, and James is really coming after them. But then it's like he flips and he turns to the people who are being oppressed, and he says this to them in verse 7. He says, "Be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield his valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. You too be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Don't grumble against one another, brothers and sisters, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. Brothers and sisters, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we count as blessed those who have persevered. You've heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about in his life. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy." Then he says, "Above all, brothers and sisters, do not swear." And not talking about like using swear and cuss words, but he's talking about like swearing oaths. "Do not swear, not by heaven or by earth or by anything else. All you need to say is a simple yes or no, otherwise you will be condemned." And he just kind of tacks that on at the end there. It really doesn't have a lot to do with patience, but it just kind of like, "Oh yeah, I wanted to say this, by the way." But he talks about patience. And if you recall, or if you were part of our study early on, when we dealt with chapter 1, when he talked about perseverance, when he talked about patience, he used this Greek word that is a different Greek word than the word for patience here. Okay, so the Greek word that he used in chapter 1 when he talked about perseverance, that trials produce perseverance, was the word hupomone. And hupomone means quite literally to stand up underneath, or stand under the weight of. It literally means to stand under. But it's this idea that this heavy weight is pressing down on you and you're standing up underneath it. And so that was, as the trial is pressing down on you, he says that is a good thing, because it's creating, as you stand up underneath it, it's creating perseverance. It's giving you the ability to stand up underneath it. This, however, is different. Okay, this is a very different type of patience that he's going to talk about here, because the word he uses for be patient, my brothers and sisters, is the word macrothymia. Okay, macrothymia, and it's a compound word, two different words put together. It's macros, which means long, and thumos, which means tempered. And it's this idea of like tempering metal, that when you put it in the fire and then you go through the tempering process of like, heating it up so it's boiling red hot, and then you stick it under water and all that kind of stuff. The more you temper, the longer you temper metal, the stronger it gets. And the reason it gets stronger is because it becomes more flexible. When it hits against something, it's not brittle anymore, because the imperfections in the metal are getting taken out through the tempering process, and so the metal is less brittle. See, when you don't temper metal and you just you're shaving it off trying to make what you're trying to make, and then you hit it against something, it's going to shatter into a million pieces. My son and I used to watch this show called Forged in Fire, and this is where I learned a lot about this. And it was like they tempered this metal, and he was talking about, well, the longer you temper it, the more flexible it becomes when it hits something. And so it's this macrothymia is this long tempered idea. The longer you're tempered, the more flexible you can become when you run up against something that's difficult. It's the same, the word here, macrothymia, is the same word that the Apostle Paul uses when he says the fruit of the Spirit is long-suffering or patience. That's the same word. It's a fruit of the Spirit within us that produces patience when we run into things that are difficult. And so this is what James is saying. These people are being oppressed. They're in a very difficult situation because there are people who have a lot of means, and they are not paying these people who are working for them. They're withholding wages from them. They're treating them terribly. They're not helping them. Even though they have the means to help them, they're not helping them, and they're actually oppressing them with their wealth. These people are feeling beaten down even more than they already are. There's more than likely a famine going on in the land. And so James is telling them, he's saying, here's what you need to do. In the midst of opposition, in the midst of being oppressed, you need to be patient. Learn patience. And then he uses these illustrations. He uses an illustration of a farmer who plants his crops, and then there's these rains that come in the spring, and he's like, don't harvest yet. It's not ready yet. And then these other rains that come and don't harvest yet. There's a temptation to want to pull the things up when the storm comes, but he says, don't do that. As the storms are rolling through, what you're going to see, if you're patient, if you're long suffering, is you'll reap a real harvest at the end when it's ready. Then he says, and the second example that he uses is the prophets. He says, the prophets were oppressed for doing the right thing, for being who they were supposed to be, for saying the things that God wanted them to say. They were being oppressed for doing that. And he says, take them as your example of their patience, their long suffering, and how they were willing to endure these things because they were being who God wanted them to be, and saying and doing the things God wanted them to do. And then finally, he says, you've heard of Job. Right now in my own personal devotional reading in the morning, I'm reading through the book of Job, and it's just fascinating. The first 2 chapters in the book of Job are all about these calamities that happened to Job, and the rest of the book is a conversation that Job has with these 3 friends, and these 3 friends are trying to tell him, you must have done something wrong, you must have done something completely sinful, you're the one is deserving of this. And Job's like, I didn't do anything. Finally he's like, God, test me, I'm ready for the test. And then he gets upset with God over, like, I didn't deserve this. And God says, there's this whole back and forth, but this whole idea of that Job was patient and long-suffering in the midst of all of these calamities. And then at the very end of the book, God rewards Job. And so James says, hey, remember that story about that guy Job? Remember that God rewarded his long-suffering. He rewarded his faithfulness and his perseverance and his patience. And then he said, the Lord is full of compassion and he's full of mercy. And so one of the major theological themes that we see through the book of James is that God rewards patience, and that oftentimes it's not the reward that we think it's going to be. But more often than not, the reward is the ability to withstand, the ability to be flexible in the midst of difficult situations. When you go through something difficult and you're able to be long-tempered in that process, you can then turn around and go, hey, God's doing something in my life that's kind of a cool thing, and wow, I'm learning to be able to endure this kind of stuff more. And so that's the message that James is trying to put forward here for these people who are being oppressed. And how do you handle those kind of oppression, those kind of oppressive things? Do you get outraged? Do you go after people? Do you try to fight back? And do you try to, take revenge and all that kind of stuff? And James says, no. Patience, macrothymia, long-tempered, long-suffering. That's how we handle these kind of situations. Well, the very next part of James is going to be our last passage that we're going to look through the book of James. Hopefully this has been a really encouraging study for you. Hopefully you're getting a lot of the practical theology we're talking about, but also the biblical theology of the big theological themes that James wants to bring up, and seeing how that even though this was a faith kind of a theology in transition towards what Christianity would eventually become, there's still a lot of merit to what James is saying here in a practical sense of how we live out this thing called faith. And so hopefully you've been gleaning a lot of that. All right. Well, thanks for hanging out with me today. Like, subscribe, comment. I'd love to interact with you guys in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video.